G'day you mob, welcome to this episode of the Goss, where I sit down with my old man every single week and chat to him about what's been going on in the news, whether down under or elsewhere in the world. We kind of just sit down, have an impromptu conversation, you know. Sometimes we've looked up stories online and we try and touch on those, give our opinions, and also give you guys the down low about what's been going on. But yeah, the whole point is to give you all sorts of different topics that we talk about in English to help you learn the vocab and just how to talk about these topics when they come up in conversation, right? To help you form your own opinion. Whether you agree with us or not, the whole point here is to just give you content to absorb, to listen to, and to use to better inform yourselves, come up with your own opinions, expand your English, and allow you to talk about these issues yourself. Anyway, today is the first part of sort of two episodes that we did on the same day. So the first one here, we talk about Australian currency and how it used to be an imperial system like England, where we had the pound and shillings and pence, and that in 1966 we switched over to the metric system. And we also talk about how the Australian Mint thinks that 5 and 10 cent pieces are going to disappear. Dad talks about the transition period, what it was like back in the 60s, and pub games they used to play. We talk about counterfeit money in Australia. And then we switch gears and talk about car accidents. There was a tragic car accident in Australia because of a drink driver. So we talk about drink driving. And then we get on to how coronavirus victims who were Australians ended up in Christmas Island being quarantined for a few weeks. And then we also talk about why Christmas Island is set up the way it is and why it's used for illegal immigrants or asylum seekers in Australia. So there's quite a lot in this episode. But anyway, let's dive in, guys. Give that kookaburra a cheeky poke. Let's start it playing, and I will see you in the episode. Dad, what's going on?
Hey, Pete. Yeah, well, we're a few days delayed for your listeners who are not going to know because this will go up in sequence. But yeah, I've been working on Wednesdays and then been sick for a couple of days, but I'm back.
I know, you're back. So how are you feeling now? You feeling better? You're all
fired up for another session.
Chipper?
Yeah.
So what's been going on in the news this week? What's the story?
The one from last week that we actually didn't touch on because we had so much other stuff to talk about was the change in currency potentially.
Well, it's not
official
currency
yet. No, but it's not official yet. But the rumours are out now that we're going to drop our 5 and 10 cent pieces from our circulating currency.
So do you want to talk about the history there of Australian currency and dive into that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, why not? We could do that.
Because it's been interesting.
Because I've lived through it. Lived through the whole decimal currency thing because it changed over in February 1966. We changed from the...
What was the jingle? Were you going to sing it for us?
No, you don't want me to sing, I promise you.
What is it? Yeah, in come the dollars, and in come the cents, out go the
pounds, and out go the pence.
The pence, yeah.
Blah, 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 blah. On the 14th of February 1966.
Yeah.
And that was even built into the jingle, so it's just implanted in people who are my age.
So what happened? We had the British currency system.
We had the British currency system. It was Australian notes and coins, but they were completely tied to the British sterling. So one Australian pound equaled one English pound, one shilling was one English shilling, and so on.
It was a pretty confusing system because it wasn't metric, right?
Yeah, and it was one of those weird things where I grew up at primary school with pound, shillings and pence as our currency. Yeah. And and that was one of the challenges when I was in third grade, so 8, 9 years old when the change happened. But that was just at about the time in your education where you start doing applied arithmetic. So it wasn't just adding up numbers. It was, well, what if we add, the equivalent now would be $1.10 to 75 cents.
Yeah.
And that's relatively simple because it's obviously decimal. But when they were saying add £1, 2 shillings and 6 to 7 shillings and 9 pence, then you had to know that there were different numbers. There were different numbers of pennies to a shilling and different shillings to a pound.
What were they?
A pound was 20 shillings.
Yeah.
And a shilling was 12 pennies.
So why was it set up that way?
Who knows?
Who decided? Has it just been that way for hundreds of years in Britain?
I think, yeah, this is a complete guess, but I think that those original English sterling came from value of coins that were being minted out of silver. And so a pound, I think, was a pound coin of, not a pound in weight. It would be worth a lot more than a pound of silver. But I think those sort of coins. So I think it really just did come down to, well, what does this actually equal in value at the time? And then it just became a historical sort of anomaly where you ended up with these ridiculous things. And that whole imperial measurement system, which was invented in Britain as well, where you have 12 inches to a foot, 3 foot to a yard, 22 yards to a chain, 8 chains to a mile, to all those sort of things don't make any sense.
How did that happen with a lot of these units? Was it that lots of different places use different units of measurement? So some places would use, a foot to measure distance, others would use a yard, and then they came together and tried to unite them.
But they actually did add up. That's the weird thing. It wasn't like one group of people decided that they were going to use a foot as a linear measure for something that foot was 30 centimetres or 30.48 centimetres. But it wasn't as if somebody did that until the metric system was invented, where you had, like a foot is 30.48 centimetres. It wasn't random. People had actually decided. So they were building new measures and measures that were useful for the things that they were doing. So, a chain, which was 22 yards or 66 feet, literally was the length of a chain that was used by surveyors. That was the amount of chain that they actually could physically carry and manage to measure things. So it was chained so that it was metal and it didn't stretch.
But was that because links were of a certain
well, they made
size?
Made the links. But, it was sort of like, well, a 22-yard chain was about as heavy a thing that one or two people could measure. And they used to literally just flip them around and spin a chain around. That's 22 yards, next one's 44, next one's 66, and so on. Why it was ever 22 yards, who knows? But it probably made some sense when it was originally made.
It always blows my mind because, obviously Britain had the imperial system for a long time. The French came up with the metric system, right? And then, I don't know, my history and the timing of these things isn't very solid, but I imagine that the British colonised America. They gave them the imperial system and Canada as well. And they came to Australia, brought the imperial system as well. Why did America have the dollar and yet they still use the imperial system for everything else?
Who knows? Well, I think currency and measurement were sort of separate. But it's weird that the Americans dropped the English currency system and created a dollar.
Well, I can imagine that was to do with their own independence.
They wanted to make, when they made their own.
Why not do it with the measurements and everything too?
I know.
To make more sense.
And the irony is that the only two countries in the world now, I thought there may well be a few small colonies around or ex-colonies around, but the only two major countries in the world now that are still using imperial measurement is the United States and the United Kingdom.
Well, it's weird too because the United States publicly uses those numbers, but all of the scientific world over there uses the metric system.
Including in the United States.
Well, that's what I mean. It's in the United States. So you quite often have to know the two, right? And Fahrenheit is confusing as hell because -30 is 0 Celsius, right?
32 Fahrenheit
32
is 0
Fahrenheit
Celsius.
So that's the freezing point. But
again, Fahrenheit made no sense. I think that was just, and I presume it was... Mr. Fahrenheit. This is way back in the history of my understanding of science. Mr. Fahrenheit, who invented the thermometer, clearly just invented a thermometer, put a scale on it, and then measured the freezing and boiling points of water.
Whereas what happened with Celsius, they worked out, okay, we're going to make 100 the boiling point of water and 0 the freezing point, and we'll put 100 points between that.
We'll take that as the common scale that people are familiar with, and we'll make that 100 degrees. So... It's all a bit weird. But so decimal currency. So we went from pounds, shillings and pence to dollars and cents in 1966. And the original currency that came out was a 1, 2, 5, 10, 20 and 50 cent piece. So coins. And what were the ones and twos were copper, and the 5s up to 50s were notionally silver, although they didn't contain much silver. I think it was mostly nickel.
Well, they had that in the first few years. They had too much silver in the 50 cent pieces.
The round 50 cent piece that was originally made when they created it was just prior to a surge in the silver price. And so it ended up with a lot more than 50 cents worth of silver in it. So people were melting them down to get the silver out. And so they the mint made a new 50-cent piece fairly quickly. The irony now is that if you've got one of those original 50-cent pieces, the round ones, they're worth a lot more as a collector's item than the silver that's contained in them.
Because everyone was chewing through them.
They were so
right?
rare.
Yeah, they're gone, and they're round. So why did they make them, what would you call a 12-sided?
I think they wanted to make it completely different from the original round 50.
Yeah, so it's like a hexagon times 2. Yeah, dodecahedron. So 12 sides.
Not hedron. Hedron is three-dimensional, but
dodecagon.
Yeah, a dodecagon. It's,
so it's got 12 sides to it. So it's pretty unique.
Yeah, it is. It's a weird one. But, they wanted to make it different enough from the original 50. It's the same size, but it's no longer round. And we had a 1, a 2, a 5, a 10, and a $20 note. The $50 notes were added a long time later, and then the hundreds after that. Yeah. And then we dropped the 1s and 2s and turned those into coins.
Oh, there's that story. In fact, I think I've got it up here somewhere. There's a $1 note that someone tipped me with in the restaurant, and they hadn't been in Australia for 30 years or something.
Yeah, and they still had them.
And they still had it in their wallet or whatever, and they were just like, here's $1.
I don't think they're legal tender anymore. But,
I have no idea.
But they're probably worth more to a collector than they are on, it's $1
I was just I'll keep that
on the street.
But was it confusing going through that process of changing currencies, or was it relatively smooth?
I think it was. I was 9 years old, as I said at the time. So,
ironically, that's probably the time when I stopped seeing 1s and 2-cent pieces being used in Australia. Right? They took those out of
exactly
circulation.
So for us, it was something new to learn. But at that age, you learn new stuff all the time, so it wasn't really confusing.
But did your parents have a hard time?
There are a lot of older people, I think, who just continued to do the conversion in their head.
Yeah.
Like you could do the conversion because $1 was half a pound, so $2 was a pound, and we even made the $2 note green like the £1 note, so that you could recognise it immediately as, well, this is worth a pound. And we used to have a 10 shilling note that was brown like our $1 note. So again, that was very similar. And the coins were made same sizes, so that sixpence, 6 pennies, which became 5 cents, were the same size. They were the same. They were basically interchangeable. The 10 cent and the shilling were the same. The 2 shilling and the 20 cents were the same. There was no equivalent of a 50-cent piece because 2 shillings was the biggest coin that you had, other than going way back to where we had a crown, which was 2.5 shillings worth. But we never used that in Australia.
What were guineas?
A guinea was £1 10 pence. So
is that a coin though, or a note?
It was no,
or just a measurement. It was just a number.
Yeah, and again, I think that was originally a measure that was related to the notes and coins. It would have been coming from. So there would have been a guinea piece at some stage, a coin that was made out of a particular value.
Well, and I assume it's related to New Guinea.
No,
right? The name at least. I don't know about
it's the same spelling, but I'm not sure where the
or guinea pig,
Guinea, and Guinea, the country, and then New Guinea, the next country. I don't know where that origin comes from. We'll have to look that one up. There's a question on notice to look up for next time.
Yeah, because that's the only time you see that weird word, right? Guinea pigs.
Yeah.
New Guinea, Guinea, and a guinea, as in the currency.
It's all the same
value.
spelling, but I'm not sure what the origin of the thing was. Yeah, so. The one you're talking about, the $1 note that you got, the $2 note was the one that I missed when that disappeared, because I remember we used to play this game, a pub game, when I was about 18 or 19, and the way the $2 note was built, back in those days we were using paper, and it was a very particular sort of paper, but to make it a lot more difficult to counterfeit, they put a metal thread through the paper. And it wasn't cut in exactly the same location every time. It was obviously put through a cutting machine, and the cutting machine would be a few millimetres out onto where the metal thread actually was in the paper when they were cutting them, and then they obviously went and printed them and so on. But the $2 note, on one side of the note had John MacArthur, who was one of the original wealthy people in Australia, and effectively created the sheep industry, the wool industry in Australia. So he was commemorated on the $2 note. And they had pictures of sheep on it. And the largest sheep, the nose of the largest sheep, was about aligned with where the metal thread went through. So we used to have this game called sheep races. And because of the inconsistency in where the metal thread was, the sheep would either be short of the line, on the line, or past the line. So you all week you'd collect your best $2 note to see the one who had the sheep that was the furthest past the line. And then, but this was back in the days of 10 o'clock closing in pubs. So a bell would ring at 9:45 in the pub. And it was for last drink, so you couldn't order a drink after that time. And so that bell used to be the sheep races thing for our group of friends. And we'd all pull our $2 note out, and whoever had the sheep the furthest past used to take all of the $2 note, so you'd win it. But you had to sign, completely illegal, defacing the Queen's currency. You had to sign your winning note, so you couldn't reuse the good one next time, and you had to go and collect them again. So when the $2 notes went, that pub game just disappeared. So
that's so sad.
It was a funny one. And I talk about that to people all the time, particularly in Australia. Nobody can remember, though. Nobody knows. So, but in the one bar in the one pub where I grew up, it was just a common thing. So somebody obviously invented it there, but it never got any currency, if you'll excuse the pun, because the $2 notes disappeared. And so
I wonder if there is anything like that happens with the current notes.
Yeah, there may be. I don't know. I haven't. Other than just naming them by colour.
Yeah,
the pineapple, the lobster.
There's even a few doubles, right?
I've
seen like the green ghost as well as the green tree frog. And a few of those. Sorts of things.
Based on colour. But of course, now our notes are no longer paper; they're plastic. So made a particular.
Well, and it's funny with $100 notes, you never see them unless you pull them out of the bank, right? I'm sure that's always the case. Well, you never with the highest denomination.
The thing is, you can't get them as change.
Yeah.
So if you go somewhere and you can't give a higher note than 100.
Well, unless
to get 100 back in change.
Unless someone's buying something off you, right?
Unless somebody's paying you for things. So that really the only place that people typically get them is in high cash transactions or going to a bank to get cash out. So they're nearly always mint. That's the weird thing, that you never see a crushed up $100 note.
Isn't there some crazy story too where $100 notes, it's something like all have traces of cocaine on them or something, because they've gone around, they tend to be used much more by people buying illicit
buying
things,
illicit stuff,
in bulk.
Yeah, well, that was probably true back in the paper days. I'm not sure now.
Especially in America, in Miami. And
the plastic ones are not obviously going to absorb as much as they do in as paper. But although they were paper in Australia, but the notes in the United States are not made out of paper. As in, they're not cellulose from wood.
It's still hemp?
They're made out of cotton and linen, because cotton linen weave is much tougher than paper. It doesn't rip as easily.
But you can still burn it.
You can still
can't do that in Australia.
Burn it. Yeah. And so the funny thing about that is Australia was the first place in the world to have plastic notes.
Yeah.
And now several other countries, including Canada, for example,
Britain, New Zealand, I assume,
and they, as far as I know, certainly Canada and New Zealand both use the Australian polymer.
Well, that's our invention. That was one of our inventions.
And so we send the polymer overseas, and they obviously print their own. Their mints print their own. They use our plastic to do it. And it's that, obviously it's a unique form of plastic, so it's easy to detect, relatively easy to detect forgeries, but it also is an easy one to create holograms in, so that we have little blank spots with holograms and those sort of things in them. So
I was when I was getting the money out recently to buy that car that we went up and bought, and you guys will hear this on another episode that's probably already released by the time you hear this episode, but I pulled out $20,000 worth of cash from the bank, and the lady was like, I don't know if we have that much. Ended up having that much, and I was chatting to her whilst she was counting it out, and I was she was mentioning something about forgeries, and I'm like, is that still a problem? Like, you guys still get forgeries? Because I would have thought, because of these polymer banknotes, it's just so difficult to try and forge these that you would never see them. And she's like, all the time, every week or two
in particular.
Yeah, well, and she was saying that what happens is people forge them. Small, mum and pop groups like do the forgeries at home, and they go into places like McDonald's during rush hour where there's a young kid behind the till, and they break a big note buying something very small like a hamburger for $2.
Yeah, exactly.
Get
so
the
you get
change
$48 out
and then
of a 50.
bail. Yeah, exactly. And then the kid obviously just puts it through McDonald's cash register, till, whatever. They come to the bank with the cash at the end of the night or the end of the week, and then there's all the forged notes that have been broken at the restaurant.
Yeah, and look,
that's how it's done these days. Because I was thinking big size things like there's someone has a briefcase full of $1 million worth of forged notes, and they go and buy a house or with cash or whatever. But it's this sort of stuff. The minor.
And I haven't seen them recently, but I know that the previous, because we've had 2 rounds of the plastic notes now where we've changed the design and changed some of the structure in them. And I believe, and this is hearsay, but I believe that the reason we went for the second round was because they were more difficult to forge.
Yeah.
Because I remember when the first plastic notes came out, I got a forgery.
Really?
Yeah, and I got it out of an ATM. So clearly,
even the banks are getting
tricked. ATMs, and even though they're branded banks, they're actually managed by a third-party company. But
so they're putting the cash in, not the bank.
And so and the irony was this is back in the days before it was easy to transfer money backwards and forwards. Before internet banking, you couldn't transfer money backwards and forwards between different banks very easily. And so I was paying off a credit card bill, and so I walked to the ATM in one bank, took out $500, so it came out as 1050s, walked across the road to the other bank, handed over my 1050s to pay off $500 off my credit card, and the teller looked at one and just said, "This is a forgery. How did you get this?" And I said, "I just got it out of the ATM across the road." And I still had my ATM's receipt. And he said, "Well, I can't take it. Go back over the road to the other bank." So I went back over the road to the other bank and said, "Look, I have no way of proving that this actually came out of your machine, but it did."
Yeah.
And so they looked up my account and went, "Yes, we can see that you've just taken $500 out of our machine."
Yeah.
And so they honoured it. They actually took it back and changed it over. But that was how common they were, that they were even appearing in ATMs back in those days.
So note to self, if you find yourself with a
dodgy-looking
note, that's a 50 or something, take out $500, put a good 50 in your pocket, put that 50 back in the $500 and go back into the bank to ask them to change it over and honour it.
Yeah.
So what's happening? They're getting rid of the 5 and 10 cent pieces. 20 minutes later, we'll get to the actual story.
We actually get to the news story. Yeah, well, the reason we got rid of 1s and 2s is because they were no longer of any value. You can't now. It's the same with 5s and 10s. There's almost nothing that you would walk into a store and pay 5 cents for and walk out.
Or 1 cent or 2 cent with those
and 1s and 2s 20 years ago.
And you don't want to be carrying around a fistful of copper 1 cent coins to get yourself a 10 cent candy.
Unlike catch up, America. Yeah. That's one of the things. I used to travel in North America a lot with work, and that was one of the things that just drove me nuts. And in fact, it drove everybody nuts because almost every cash store, particularly small stores where you're handling cash. So if you walk into a 7-Eleven or some convenience store to buy a drink or something, you're very rarely going to then anyway, a few years ago, you wouldn't use your credit card, so you'd use cash. And apart from the fact that Americans put the tax on after the price, so a $2 item will cost you $2.21.
That always irritated me on the holiday when we'd go there, because you get your money right, you get your money ready to go to Macca's or whatever.
$2 drink.
Here's $2, and they'll be like, it's $2.10 or whatever.
I know. And so so you end up with these just random amounts of money everywhere, and then for random amounts of change. But because they have no 2 cent coin, then you end up with, if you've got something in it that ends in a 1 or a 6, you end up with 4 1 cent pieces, 4 pennies. Ironically, the Americans, it's a 1 cent coin, but they call them a penny. Work that out.
The imperial system,
And so you end up with just piles of crap. There's a whole lot of shrapnel of 1 cent pieces, but most of those places now just have a little jar or a little tray out the front saying "Give a penny, take a penny." So if people would just get the 4 pennies in their change, toss them in there, but if then something came out as this is going to cost you $2.01, you'd take the 1 cent out of the tray and give it to them rather than having to carry your own around and get more crappy change.
My sort of memory of the one pennies from the US is watching, I think it was Home and Alone 2, when they're in New York, and Marv is walking around with the other guy, Joe Pesci, the small guy with the beanie that's getting burnt at the top. Marv's the big lanky guy, and I remember him putting tape on his hands, like double-sided tape, and then walks past a Santa who's like busking and just shoves his hand in the pot of coins and pulls out a fist, and it's just covered in 1 cent or pennies. And being like, wow. And the guy's just like, good job, Marv. You got yourself about $1. They're changing.
So the potential now is to drop 5s and 10s. And look, I know when Singapore updated their currency a few years ago, and the lowest coin they have there, I think, is a 10 now. New Zealand updated their currency a few years ago. I think the lowest they have now is a 10. So 5s and 10s are almost useless. the challenge is going to be, and another sort of random story about Ian's belligerence when he goes shopping, is when we first dropped the 1 cent pieces. Our postage was still 49 cents.
Yeah. And
I walked into a post office and I was just posting one letter and I said, I want a 49 cent stamp. And they said, that'll be 50 cents. And I said, no, you have to give me a 1 cent stamp in change.
G'day, mate. That was the first half of this episode of The Goss. If you would like to continue watching or continue listening to this episode, make sure that you sign up for the premium podcast or academy memberships at aussieenglish.com.au, where you will get full access to these entire episodes of this series and much, much more. You can go check that out using the links below or just go to aussieenglish.com.au. Once again, thank you so much for joining me, mate, and I will see you next time. Peace.